Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Fellner. I'm an attorney representing community associations throughout Maryland and the District of Columbia. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the concept of selective enforcement. I sometimes call these bad words or curse words within our industry because they're something that an association board truly wants to avoid, and they can cause a whole host of problems during the enforcement procedure and in laying out rules and regulations within an association. The concept of selective enforcement is that an association board is treating the same or similar issues differently from owner to owner. That's not supposed to happen or take place. The association is supposed to treat like situations in like fashion, and that's why they set out policies, procedures, and other things. Now, first of all, don't do this intentionally. The association should be treating all its unit owners fairly and equally, and treating similar situations similarly, so that owners have predictability, so that they know what they can expect from the board. As Lou Holtz used to say, burning down your neighbor's house isn't going to make yours look any nicer. So make sure that you're not deliberately doing this. Unfortunately, sometimes an allegation or a claim of selective enforcement can come up during the association process. That can be by disparate impact, for instance. A well thought out and properly conceived policy can look like it is treating different owners differently. It may or may not be true. You want to take a look at that and make any adjustment that is necessary. Often owners can use it as a defense or even as an offense to try to get what they want. They try to put in a deck, they look down the road and they say, well, some owners in this association have a similar deck that I want, and so I'm going to go on the offensive and I'm going to make this claim, whether it's true or not. Regardless of that, you still do want to examine your policies and make sure that they're treating everyone equally. Now today we're going to discuss three concepts. We're going to talk about waiver, severability, and then setting policies and procedures. First of all, waiver. The idea of selective enforcement comes from the concept of contractual waiver. Each covenant within the CC&Rs or each use restriction within the condominium bylaws is its own separate contractual right. Can be enforced in just the same way as any other private contract between two parties, and it can be waived. Waiver can happen in a couple of different ways. Number one, it can be expressly waived. I hereby waive that right. Done. Expressly waived. And waiver can also be inferred or implied from conduct. And that's what we're talking about here with selective enforcement. An association can be inferred to have waived the right to enforce a certain right if they don't enforce it repeatedly. Now, a waiver requires three elements. It has to be knowing, intentional, and voluntary. The knowing one is very important, especially in the condominium context. If you have internal modifications, changes, or other things inside the unit that are done, and they never come to the attention of the condo board, and then another unit owner tries to make a certain similar change or modification and argues that that first one existed already, the waiver there by the board of directors wasn't knowing, because they had no way or opportunity of being aware that that conduct was happening within the other unit. Intentional means that the board has to make a choice to enforce or not to enforce against that first instance of this violation or alleged violation before it can be deemed that they have waived it. And voluntary. Well, the owner says, I'm going to punch you unless you let me install my new fence. That was not a voluntary waiver, even if they decide not to go ahead and go forward there. So knowing, intentional, and voluntary waiver has to take place in order for that selective enforcement to be found. Now, the second concept is severability. Each one of these covenants, or each one of these use restrictions, is its own separate contractual right. So waiving one doesn't waive the right to enforce every single one of them. For instance, if there's a mailbox restriction and everyone in the neighborhood puts in different mailboxes and the association does nothing about it, that covenant is probably waived. But if there's another restriction on house shingle color, fencing, things like that. Those all are not waived just by the association's waiver of the mailbox covenant. Each one of those separate covenants is distinct and is severable from one another. So if an association decides to pursue a violation for sheds, they've never pursued one in the neighborhood before, they've never had such a violation previously, but the owner argues, hey, you haven't been enforcing against the fence violations down the street. That's not a valid selective enforcement defense. Now, that question can get very factual. It can get into the question of, for instance, if an association lets fences that violate its height restrictions go, but then pursues another owner who puts in a fence that violates the color restrictions. Have they waived the entire fence covenant? That's a very factual question. It's one that's probably going to end up in court if you start to get down into that. And so that's why we're going to now talk about the third concept, which is avoiding court, and which is setting forth good policy. Community association documents often contain broad rights that associations have in terms of what they can regulate and what they can enforce. Those rights also frequently say the association board has the ability to put forth guidelines. Sometimes associations wait too long until they have a violation before they start really thinking about what they want to permit. Can't encourage you strongly enough not to wait that long, to put out for your owners, for their benefit, for your benefit, so that you can easily enforce, so that you can recognize what's a yes, what's a no, what's a violation. Policies on as many of these things as frequently come up. And these policies are going to change over time. A great example these days is a lot of covenants or policies have prohibitions on metal fences. The only thing that used to fall under that purview was chain link fences, and they were generally thought to be not terribly attractive and something that people often wanted to push against. However, today there are very handsome and nice looking aluminum fences that exist, and so the prohibition on metal fences may be something that you want to update, that your association wants to update, to describe that just a little bit more clearly. There are a lot of more good examples in terms of putting out those rules and policies. And then the final portion of that policy and avoiding dispute portion is the way that you enforce and pursue violations. When you have a report of a violation, you should treat each of them the same. You should go through whatever your dispute resolution policy is. That should exist. You should consider having on file a schedule of fines so that you can not only enforce equally against like violations, but even fine and sanction equally against like violations, so that when a new situation comes up, you look and say, hey, this falls under category A, Y, X, whatever it is, of our schedule of fines, and we know exactly how to treat it. And that way, that unit owner or that lot owner can't complain that you were treating them unfairly. It was right there in the schedule. They knew about it in advance. Selective enforcement, something to avoid for community associations, but it is avoidable, and especially, first of all, don't do it on purpose, but secondly, if you keep those three concepts in mind of waiver, severability, and policy setting enforcement. Thanks, I'm Brian Fellner. My law firm is Fellner Legal Services, and our motto is service, success, simple.